Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. Just hang tight. Hey, folks, we're going to get started in about a minute. We're just waiting for people to sign on. And again, we'll be starting in about a minute. Thanks. All right, folks, give us another minute. We're checking the Q&A function that it's working properly. So just give us 1 second. We're gonna we have to just test that real quick before we get started. So hang tight. Okay, we are good to go. So welcome everybody to the webinar today. We're going to be talking about the private cellular networks market. We're going to be sharing some data from 2020. I'm going to be making forward-looking statements as well, things that have happened since then. This is the first edition of our private cellular networks vendor benchmark. This is a report that we will be building out over the next few years, adding vendors and actively tracking how this market proliferates. So let's jump right in here. This is me, the presenter, Chris Antlitz. My email is there. I'm the principal analyst of the telecom practice at TBR. Feel free to email me if you guys have follow-up questions or anything at the end of the after the webinar. So this is the portfolio of syndicated reports that my group writes. TBR covers the entirety of the ICT sector. My group just focuses on the telecom space within that broader ICT sector. So these are the reports we write. The one in boldface there, Private Cellular Networks Vendor Benchmark, that's the report we're going to be reading out today. Just so everybody knows, we're going to be doing other webinars on the web scale topic, on the 5G public networks topic, and the edge compute topic as this year progresses. So keep an eye out for invitations for those webinars. And lastly here, we do a range of vendor reports, benchmarks, market forecasts, and market landscapes. There's a mix of folks that subscribe to our portfolio on this call, and there's a mix that do not. The folks that do, you can access the reports through your portals, through your the account liaison to TBR, if you want to get the full reports for these. Okay, so we need to spend some time to talk about the taxonomy because different people have different definitions of what is a private cellular network. So we had to standardize the entire taxonomy down to an apples-to-apples comparison when we did the benchmarking. So I need to walk everybody through those slides. There's about 4 of them. And then once we get through the taxonomy, everybody's on the same page, what exactly the data we're showing is talking about, then we can go into the meat of the deck. So just bear with me here. I think everybody will find this pretty interesting. First off, this is what's in the report. So in the benchmark, we're looking at revenue and market share by the major vendors. So we started this report with 6 vendors. We will be adding more vendors in upcoming reports. But we started with 6. You're going to see these 6 in the data today. We're looking at RAN, core, transport, and the full life cycle of services pertaining to that infrastructure. So when we talk about market size, that's what we're talking about, the sum of those domains on a per vendor basis. We are also talking about revenue by tech type, so LTE and 5G. And we're going to be looking at cuts by the different regions, so North America, CALA, EMEA, and APAC. Just for timing, I had to focus on certain slides over others. But again, if you want to see the full report, for those who are subscribers, you can see the entirety of it through your portals. Okay, so taxonomy. So this is a diagram that NetMania has put out. The link down there, the sources down there. This parses private networks and public networks, I think, pretty well. We're still working on our own diagram, if you will, but there's so much complexity in this market. There's so many different procurement models, so many different architectural models that an enterprise can leverage that, you know, we're still trying to get all of that in a really succinct manner. This is one of the better ones that I've seen. So the green box is what we're covering in this report. So these are standalone networks that are owned, operated, controlled by a non-CSP entity. And again, that's what we're talking about on this call. Anything having to do with the public infrastructure where a CSP owns the infrastructure and is providing a network slice, as an example, over that public infrastructure, that is not included in this report, not in the data. That's in a separate report that TBR writes, which we call the 5G telecom market landscape and the 5G telecom market forecast reports. I'm going to try and do a webinar on those reports later this year. Those reports focus on the public infrastructure opportunity of 5G, and those are very telco-centric reports. Okay, so elaborating more on what I was just showing in that diagram, we're making a distinction between a private network and a public network. So the stuff in green, and that green box is what we're talking about on this call. The stuff in the gray box is public infrastructure. That's not what we're talking about today. So what we are talking about is situations where a non-CSP entity, CSP stands for communication service provider. So it could be a business, could be a government agency, is procuring, owning, and controlling, but they may or may not operate that infrastructure. And specifically, we're talking about LTE and 5G. These network resources tend to be consumed internally. There's full visibility and control over the traffic running on that network. It's a self-sufficient environment. It might interface with the public network, and we do see examples of that happening in the market. But again, what we're capturing here is what non-CSP entities are spending on the infrastructure. So literally, non-telcos buying RAN, buying core, buying transport cables and the active electronics and operating that maybe with their CIO department or CDO function, however they're set up in the organization, and they're running that environment. We are including situations where so if a CSP is leasing licensed spectrum to a non-CSP entity, that's included in this report because the non-CSP entity is the actual entity that's doing the procurement of the infrastructure, even though they're using licensed spectrum from a CSP. We're including those situations. We're also including situations where a telco is providing value-added services, such as managed services, to support a non-CSP entity-owned private cellular network. So these are situations where the telco might have a systems integration arm or other capabilities that they're bringing into a PCN solution, but they're not owning and operating the infrastructure. That's the stipulation I want to stress here. It's about who owns that infrastructure, who's buying it, who owns it, who controls it. That's the distinction that we're making in our taxonomy. Okay, and again, network slicing is in those other reports. So there's another slide here. I'm not going to belabor this, but essentially there's a bunch of complexity in who owns what circumstances, other parties like resellers, systems integrators that play a key role in these PCN engagements, who owns what, how are we accounting for that revenue. This slide essentially, gives you an idea of how we parse those different situations. I'm not going to belabor this because we're going to get into the weeds really quickly. But essentially, the things I want to stress here is what's in the market size is LTE and 5G. Any variants of LTE and 5G, such as ELTE, is included. We're going to see some standards, customized standards that get built, but based off of 3GPP standards, and technically they are cellular solutions, so we are including those situations. And the other thing I want to stress here is there are many different types of companies that supply this market. I have a slide that's coming up that's going to show the different segments of the vendor community and what their value contribution is to the ecosystem. And if there's revenue transacting between the non-CSP entity and those vendors, we're including those situations as long as it pertains to the LTE and 5G infrastructure. Okay, so examples of where private cellular network infrastructure is typically located. So there's a list here of different verticals, and these are some of the locations that you would typically find a PCN to be at. So the verticals, by the way, are listed in alphabetical order, so there's no particular reason in terms of relative size of market. We didn't rank them. It's just in alpha order. So some examples of this: financial services, high frequency trading environments. So think about hedge funds that are using 5G to execute trades faster than they could do with legacy technologies. Think about bank branches. Think about campuses, smart city implementations, factories, warehouses, railways, power plants. All those types of locations are where you'll tend to see PCN infrastructure. It could be public infrastructure, but what we're seeing increasingly is there is a clear trend towards privately owned infrastructure in these types of locations. And we'll get into some of the reasons why in upcoming slides. Okay, so that's the taxonomy. Let's get into some of the content. Also, a couple of housekeeping things. If you guys have questions, just add them to the Q&A box, and I'll go through them at the end. I did save about 15 to 20 minutes or so to go over questions. I'm sure there's going to be a lot. about this topic. And if you want the slides, there'll be a email address that you can email to get a copy of them. Okay, so there is rapid growth in the PCN market. So between 2019 and 2020, we estimate the PCN market grew 22% year over year. That's a global number, okay? And that is incredibly strong when you think about the traditional network infrastructure market where, you know, it's been pretty much flat, slightly up because of the aggressive 5G investment in China has been leading to some growth in the market. But when you think about the double-digit growth, and in our market forecast, we have a sustained double-digit growth rate for this market. This is an area of keen interest for the vendor community as a means to really drive growth for their respective companies. LTE is the dominant technology for the vast majority of the current PCN builds. So if you look at the landscape today, over 90% of those PCN networks are LTE today. Our estimates are 92% of the market. 92% is LTE revenue for the vendors, and you have 8% for 5G. That was in 2020. Those figures I just gave. So with that said, 5G was a small portion of the overall PCN market in 2020, but we are expecting it to grow rapidly in coming years. There is some slowdown in terms of standards, and so specifically 3GPP release 17 is delayed to mid-2022. That's problematic when you think about some of the key features there. URLLC, TSN. These are features that enterprises they need those for what the types of use cases they're trying to do with 5G. There's also the chipset problem, the shortages everybody's, I'm sure, well aware of. And then thirdly, it's the lack of endpoint devices. So the infrastructure is ready, but the device ecosystem is not ready yet. So there's a disconnect in timing that is causing 5G to not start off as fast as I think the industry was originally expecting last year. This year, it's also looking quite slow, relatively slow, because of those issues of the standards, chips, and the devices. Next year, I think we're going to see the 5G market rapidly scale, like very high double-digit rate, as those issues start to get addressed and the market can come into alignment. In the meantime, LTE, what we're seeing is vendors are pitching the enterprises on the software upgradability of the LTE solutions. So what they're basically saying is, hey, 5G is not quite ready yet, but you can buy our off-the-shelf LTE solution. And when 5G is ready, you can do a remote software upgrade, maybe a little bit of hardware additions in the field, and you're running a 5G network at an incremental cost. That is very attractive to some enterprises that want to get a head start here. They want to be participating in the innovation, and they want to get a head start over the competition in some of the use cases for that these networks can enable. So that is definitely a trend that we see moving into this year. The second key point I want to make is that sales funnels are burgeoning. It's proliferating. So the pace with which the interest in the ecosystem is scaling. So conversations between vendors and interested enterprises, the number of those types of conversations that are happening are rapidly scaling. There's quite broad interest across verticals in this topic. It's not just 5G, it's also edge computing and AI, and how those technologies kind of come together to enable digital transformation of the enterprise. so there's a lot of conversations going on. There's a lot of trials going on. There is very, very strong traction that we see. And lastly, I mentioned before, there are different procurement models for an enterprise to source these solutions. What we see happening is the systems integrators are basically, the enterprises are in most cases going straight to the SIs, and they're saying, hey, this is really complicated and new, help me. And we're seeing the SIs playing a key role in education, integration, and imagination around how enterprises can take these technologies, not just 5G, but also edge computing, AI, blockchain, cloud, how all those things kind of coalesce together to enable digital transformation. And so the SIs are actually the ones that are driving a lot of these conversations and driving the ecosystem forward. The CSPs are moving too slowly, and they're bringing too much complexity into the equation. And what we're seeing is a lot of these larger enterprises in particular are going in via other channels. Some of the vendors realized this early on, and they made strategic decisions to hedge their bets just in case the CSPs didn't get this right or weren't able to scale into the opportunity. And as you'll see in the numbers, those vendors are outperforming vendors that decided to early on that they were going to put all their eggs in the basket of the CSPs. And we'll talk a little bit about that in upcoming slides. Okay, so we have a series of bubble charts that we're going to show. And essentially what we did is took the data model and we created these bubble charts across the different segments. And this is overall PCN revenue. This is LTE and 5G combined. And what we see here is Huawei is the largest in terms of total revenue. As we're going to see in upcoming slides, the reason for that is China. So about 70% of Huawei's PCN revenue comes from China. The other 30% is other emerging markets for the most part. And for ZTE, it's about 80% we estimate of their PCN revenue is from China. The other 20% is from emerging markets. That kind of gives you an idea of how much China's spending, which is a lot. It's big numbers. They're spending the most of any country right now. And there are only a few vendors that primarily, they win a disproportionate amount of that business. So it's kind of skewing how the distribution of the market looks. When you normalize out China, Nokia is by far the leader. Nokia has the most customer wins. They have the most verticals addressed, and they have the most, I would say, the broadest portfolio. They're basically firing on all the cylinders, right? They're touching all the major points, and they're also in all of the major markets. So it's emerging markets, they're there. They're in pretty much all of the developed markets, they're there. They have deals already. Most of them are LTE, but they have a very strong position right now. And then you have Samsung and Cisco, and I'll come back to Ericsson in a minute. Samsung, about half of their revenue comes from South Korea, and then the second biggest market for them is the States. They bought a company called Cellular Solutions. That was an inorganic contribution to their PCN revenue, added a few $1 million in top line. We're talking about relatively small numbers here, so that actually did make a difference. And then Cisco supplies the PCN market through their mobile core, their transport, and their services solutions. And then for Ericsson, they bought Cradlepoint last year. There was 2 months of contribution from that. And Ericsson also is starting to hedge its bets and create an ecosystem of channel partners that they can go to the enterprise via different, different go-to-market models. So if we look at the market share distribution, basically what we did is just took the total market and then divided it, or took each vendor's revenue divided by the total market. So you could see that the top 3 players are half the market. With that said, this is actually a highly fragmented market. This market is much more fragmented than the traditional telecom market is. Many, many more players. And the next slide, I'm going to show how fragmented this actually is. You could see some examples of what I'm talking about here. So the global PCN market, LTE and 5G, was a little over $3 billion in 2020. Again, that's the infrastructure and the full life cycle of services. Of that number, around 900 million of that we estimate was China, and they were the biggest. That country spent the most on private networks in 2020, and then you have the rest of the rest of the world is quite distributed in terms of which countries are spending relative to the others. There is a lot of government stimulus that's coming into a variety of countries, and that money, we estimate around $3 trillion. So let me take a step back. In the last year and a half, the governments globally have injected about $30 trillion in a mix of fiscal and monetary stimulus in the global economy to combat COVID-19 and the economic impact of that. Of that $30 trillion, about $3 trillion of that is directly and indirectly going into the ICT sector. So of that $3 trillion, there is a portion of that is going to flow into sectors like the private cellular network space. It's going to flow into public infrastructure and, chip development, chip manufacturing, all those types of sub-markets that comprise this are going to be impacted by some of that spend. And that's another driver of the market size and the growth that we were talking about before. So a couple more points on this slide. One is that I want to make it known that CommScope and Motorola Solutions, we are planning to add them to the next report. We estimate that CommScope was the 4th largest company by market share, and Motorola Solutions was the 6th largest by market share. When you add those two, that is your top 8. So if you literally take the market, there's nobody else. Like, that is your top 8 in order, all the way through to Cisco, and then you have a long tail of other players in there, and we'll get to that list now. Okay. So who's in that rest of market category? So we broke this down by vendor type, so different segments, different categories of vendors. So the CSPs obviously play a role in the PCM space, and we have examples of what companies are playing a role here. Companies like AT&T, Vodafone, Orange, Telefonica, all the usual suspects playing a role here. The portion of revenue we're capturing is the channel aspect, so the product resale, because remember, our taxonomy, the non-CSP entity owns the infrastructure. So the telcos could be a pass-through from the OEM to the customer, the end customer, and then the CSPs can also provide value-added services in conjunction with the infrastructure. So that could range from the installation, the design, it could be integration work, could be support functions, it could be full managed services engagement. Those are all, we have seen situations where those or a combination of those things were factored into a deal. Government contractors. So these companies sell mission critical and military grade solutions, mostly to government entities. There's there's a bunch of companies in this space. And if you look at the DoD contract, which by the way is the largest publicly announced PCN contract that we're aware of to date, that's been announced to date, $600 million over, I think, 5 years or so. Some of these names in the example list are on that. So that's just an example of how these players, companies like First RF Corporation, for example, GBL Systems, those companies are participating in that contract. So that's just an example of where you see them playing in this space. ICT ODMs, so these are companies like Supermicro, Foxconn that make the hardware. It's white box hardware, and then they might drop ship it at the customer location. So, you know, that is definitely happening in the market, where they're providing those white box solutions, and a customer might be buying directly from them or through an SI instead of through an OEM. So as an example of where you would see them in the market. ICT OEMs, this is probably the biggest segment of ROM. There are well over 100 players in this that we've identified. There's some names here. Abside Networks, as an example, is they primarily supply the public sector, so the government sector. And then you've got, you know, you have your data center companies. They might be providing, in the case of HPE, 5G core. They also have the MEC stack, which is where the 5G core will reside, and also where open virtual RAN functions can reside or will reside. Those are arms dealers for those aspects of the PCN solution. And then you've got a range of smaller companies like Ceragon, Aviat Networks, who are more on the transport side. They sell to multiple verticals. You've got the JMA Wirelesses out there. You've got, you know, NEC, Mavenir's out there. Many, many players that comprise that. And they sell branded solutions. Usually they'll provide product attached services as well with their hardware and software. ICT systems integrators. So these companies tend to be a channel. They'll do product resell. So reselling an OEM's gear or an ODM's gear, and then they'll provide value-added services on the infrastructure. So many companies in this market as well, companies like IBM, Tech Mahindra, Mugler Telco Networks is more of a pure play. That's what they do. Like they fully specialize in private cellular networks, up to the global systems integrators that are more horizontally diversified. And then you've got your industrial systems integrators. These are companies that might make sensors. They make the industrial equipment that might be 5G compatible. So think about robots in an assembly line in a manufacturing plant. They have a role in the infrastructure. You've got your pure play software vendors and ISVs, so companies like Altiostar, Athonet, Ania, Salona. These companies tend to specialize in an area. So for Altiostar, they specialize in open virtual RAN. Athonet specializes in mobile core. So the examples of that. And you've got the web scales, of course, Microsoft in particular with buying Affirm Networks and Metaswitch. They are a vendor. The Inventec deal that they have in Taiwan is a really good example where a web scale is providing the 5G PCN solution. Okay, so key takeaway from this slide, there are numerous companies in that rest of market segment. We're going to be adding those to the report over time, and highly fragmented. Okay, so I'm going to show a few cuts of the regional data now. We're going to go through the 4 main regions, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So starting with North America, Nokia is the leader in North America. They did around $150 million in 2020, according to our estimates. Again, most of that's LTE. Governments are spending big money on this. We talked about the DoD. That contract just started late last year. So there's a timing delay there, but Nokia already had a bunch of deals with utility companies, oil and gas, public safety, and they had deals with a bunch of verticals in the States especially. Ericsson has some. Ericsson has a lot more activity, a lot of trials going on. They're playing catch up with Nokia, but they definitely have some traction, especially within the last, I'd say 9 to 12 months. We've seen traction pick up there. Samsung and Cisco also have deals. Cisco more on the government side. Samsung has some deals, or more trials. They have the Cellular acquisition, so coming back to that, that added some lift for them. And they supply, the names are escaping me right now, but they are supplying a few verticals in the North America market. It's mostly in the States, not much going on in Canada aside from mining and more broadly natural resources. Most of the activity is going on in the States, and the vertical coverage is broad. And that's a general statement for the market as a whole. So in CALA, again, Nokia is the leader. Most of the spend on PCN in CALA is natural resources companies. So think about mining. And these are companies that tend to be off the grid in remote locations without access to public infrastructure. So they have to do private networks. They don't really have a choice. And they're using private networks for a variety of use cases: worker safety, cost efficiencies, machine control, the surveillance. There's other use cases. LTE is predominantly used. We're just starting to see 5G come into that market. I expect we're going to see more of that as some of those systems get upgraded over time. And there's more use cases that they can use in those locations. So that's most of it. Agriculture is another one to keep in mind. If you think about countries like Brazil, they produce, on a relative basis, they're one of the biggest producers of food in the world. And there are numerous entities in that country alone that supply the global food supply. So there might be situations where you'd be using it for agri-tech, agricultural type use cases as well. Okay, in EMEA, we've got Europe, and then we have MEA. So I'm going to parse the two of them, and then we'll talk about each one separately. So Europe has been spending quite a bit on PCN. Actually, if you look at the number of customers from a global perspective, there's actually quite a bit of emphasis on Europe. I would say that Europe probably has the most customers of the other regions for PCN. So if you think about railways and ports, and if you think about how you have many developed countries in close concentration, high concentration of manufacturing plants in countries like Finland and Germany, this is a vibrant market, vibrant opportunity for selling PCN infrastructure. And there's also spectrum available for private use. So in particular, Germany, there's 100 megahertz of 3.7 to 3.8. I think it's the N78 band. And, you know, that's being used by companies like Bosch and Siemens and others to reimagine how factories are built, and taking those facilities into the fourth industrial revolution. And these vendors are helping them do that. Not just these ones, but you know, these ones in conjunction with other ones we showed in the total market slide. In Middle East, it's a mix. So you have a mix of developed countries, like you've got Bahrain, you've got Saudi Arabia, Then you've got some other countries that are more on the emerging side. There's different, I would say, different verticals that have been buying PCN. You see a lot of oil and gas deals there. There's a lot of public safety related deals there. So those are some of the ones that we've seen quite a few of in that region. And then in Africa, it's very much natural resources as well as transport infrastructure. So think about ports and you know, things like that, where you have maritime, maybe, you know, you're docking at the bottom of South Africa and then bringing the goods up from there. There might be PCN in those ports as an example of what you typically see in Africa to date. And then in APAC, last but not least, so again, China skews the market distribution. That's why Huawei is the far and away outperformer. If you normalize China out, actually Nokia's the leader in APAC. So Nokia has deals in Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Singapore. I think they have some in India, Australia. It's quite diversified. And there's multiple verticals that are interested in PCN and that have been investing in PCN. Ericsson, similar. Ericsson has some deals in Taiwan and a few other of the more developed countries. And then Samsung, we talked about before, South Korea emphasis. Cisco is more on the Japan side, South Korea side, where they have some activity. And it's a couple of other countries too, but not as much activity there to date. Okay, so that was the content we wanted to share, and we have about 18 minutes or so for Q&A. So if you have a question, just add it to the Q&A chat box, and I'll queue them up and go down. I'm going to go right down the list. So also, if you want a copy of the slides, you can email webinars@tbri.com to get that. And if you're interested in getting the full report, you can contact Dan Demers at the bottom of the slide. His contact information is there. If you want to explore maybe not only getting the report, but if you guys are interested in doing white papers or you know, webinars for your own constituency, we do those types of things as well. So with that, I'm gonna check the Q&A here, and we're gonna write down the list. So just bear with me a second. Okay, so the first question is, I understand the spectrum used in PCN can be licensed, unlicensed, or shared. Will private businesses primarily use unlicensed spectrum? So what we see so far is a mix of licensed, unlicensed, and shared being used. It really depends on the situation. It depends on several things. So first off, what's available? We have to start there. So if you think about certain countries that don't have you know, shared or dedicated spectrum for enterprise use available, then you have to go through a CSP to license the spectrum, their spectrum, lease their spectrum. You can always use, and I think this is going to come at a later date, you can use 5G in unlicensed spectrum for NRU, so NR unlicensed feature. I think that's going to be, that has a lot of potential, but it really is a mix. It depends on what's available in not only in the country, but also from a localized standpoint, what bands are available, who owns those bands, what can you use, what are the stipulations around that. And what we see is, and this is another area where the vendor community consults the enterprises about what should their spectrum strategy be. And these are long-term decisions. So you know, this is very important to get it right the first time. So a lot of thought goes into architecting what those what that infrastructure is going to look like. Next question. Yeah, so a few people are asking about how to get the slides. So again, if you want a copy of the slides, you have to email webinars@tbri.com. It's on the right-hand side of the slide that's showing. So email that address, and they will get you a copy of the slides. So the next question is, do you have plans to include non-standard private networks in the analysis as well? So as of right now, we are not, but we are thinking about it, especially when mesh networks are becoming more interesting. So mesh networks are an alternative to traditional cellular networks, and we need to see how that plays out. Some of those are more proprietary systems, and I don't know if they're going to have the same type of ecosystem around them that cellular brings to the table. So it's a TBD, but we're definitely watching those other access mediums, if you will, that are becoming available in the market. Okay. And I need to refresh that. Okay, any other questions? I'm going to refresh the portal. Just give me a second. Okay, so yeah, if you guys have any questions, just put it in the box. If not, we can you can follow up with me after. If you're not comfortable asking the question here, you can email me, and I'll give it another minute. If there's no more questions, we can give everybody 10 minutes back of their time. So thanks very much for joining the webinar today. Hope you found it informative, and I hope everybody has a great day. Take care.